Mama made me a cap out of my first, chapter 10. Mama made me a cap out of my first coon hide. And remember, what happened is that Billy caught his first, he caught his first coon. The tree fell. God helped him because he already had splinters all over his head. He had blisters, not splinters, blisters. And he was in so much pain and he just couldn't do it anymore. He had no energy. He was in pain. His hands hurt. He couldn't even hold the axe. And there was just a little bit left to chop off so that the tree could fall, but he just could not do it. And he prayed to God, and then all of a sudden a breeze started just pushing at the tree, at the top of the tree that he was trying to chop down, and the other trees were not moving at all. So the breeze was only focused on this one tree, which is kind of crazy. kind of that's not how breezes work. If there's a breeze, all the leaves move from all the trees, not just from that tree. So he really believed that God helped him. But yeah, the tree fell down, and he got the coon. So now we're on chapter 10. Mama made me a cap out of my first coon hide. I was as proud of it as Papa would have been if someone had given him a dozen Missouri mules. Mama said afterwards that she wished she hadn't made it for me because in some way wearing that cap must have affected my mind. I went coon crazy. Oh man. Okay, so she made him a cap, a little hat, out of his first coon hide. And Mama said she wished she didn't make it for him because for some reason that made him go coon crazy. Let's see what that means. I was out after the ringtails every night. About the only time I didn't go hunting was when the weather was bad. And even then, Mama all but had to hog tie me. So he's saying that he was going hunting every single night after that cap because he just thought it was the coolest thing. The only time he didn't go was when the weather was bad, and that's only because Mama wouldn't let him. She would do everything in her power to not let him go. What wonderful nights they were, running like a deer through the thick timber of the bottoms, tearing my way through stands of wild cane, climbing over drifts and jumping logs, running, screaming, and yelling, "Hoo-wee! Get him, boy, get him!" following the voices of my little hounds. So yeah, he was just thinking about it and just saying this was just a really fun time for him. He worked hard for this, so he finally got to enjoy it. It wasn't too hard for a smart old coon to fool old Dan, but there was none that prowled the riverbanks that could fool my little Ann. So little Ann was she was the brain of the operation, but I'm sure old Dan was way stronger, so he was the brawn. The brawn means the strength of the operation. As Grandpa had predicted, the price of coonskins jumped sky high. A good-sized hide was worth from $4 to $10, depending on the grade and quality. I kept the side of our smokehouse plastered with hides. Of course, I would spread them out a little to cover more space. I always stretched them on the side facing the road, never on the back side. I wanted everyone in the country to see them. So the coonskins, just like Grandpa said, they're the fur of the coonskins is getting really popular, and and it's going to go up. The price, it's going to cost more. So when you sell them, people are going to give you more money for them. So that did happen. So he was making good money with his coonskins. But then also he had the smokehouse, and he said he always put them on the side facing the road. So he never wanted them to be in the back because then people couldn't see them when they were driving by the road. And he wanted everyone to check out his coonskins. The money earned from my furs was turned over to my father. I didn't care about it. I had what I wanted, my dogs. So he just gave the money to his dad. That's awesome. So he's helping the family. That's really great. And he had what he wanted. He just wanted his dogs. So the whole time he was saving money, he didn't care about the money. It was all about the dogs. But now that he was making money, he was helping his family, which is awesome. So the dogs helped him to help his dad and to help his little sisters and his mom. I suppose the papa was saving it for something because I never saw anything new turn up around our home. But like any young boy, I wasn't bothered by it and I asked no questions. You know what I'm thinking it might be for? And I don't know because I haven't read all the way to the end of the book. But sorry guys. I still have a lingering cough from being sick. But yeah, so I'm thinking, remember that Mom said, "Oh, I hope one day we have money to go and live into town." So that's what I'm thinking, that he's probably saving it for that. That's the only thing I can think of. My whole life was wrapped up in my dogs. Everywhere I went, they went along. There was only one place I didn't want them to go with me, and that was to Grandpa's store. Other dogs were always there, and it seemed as if all they wanted to do was jump on old Dan. Oh man. So he would take his dogs everywhere, but not to Grandpa's store because there was always other dogs there, and they always wanted to, I don't know if by jump he actually means just jump on him, on old Dan, or if they actually wanted to fight him. It got so about the only time I went to my grandfather to see my grandfather was when I had a bundle of fur to take to the store. This was always a problem, and every way I could I would always try to slip away from my dogs. Sometimes I swear that they could read my mind. It made no difference what I tried. I couldn't fool them. So he would try to get away from the dogs to go to Grandpa's store because he didn't want those dogs to jump on old Dan. So he would try to sneak away and go himself. But the dogs always knew he was leaving. One time I was sure I had outsmarted them. The day before I was to make one of my trips, I took my furs out to the barn and hid them. The next morning I hung around the house for a while and then nonchalantly whistled my way out to the barn. I climbed up to the loft and peeked through a crack. I could see them lying in front of their doghouse. They weren't even looking my way. So he went to the barn and he climbed up to the loft, just whistling, acting like nothing's going on, nothing to see here, guys. And he looked and he saw his dogs. They were just lying in front of the doghouse. They weren't looking that way. He thought, okay, they don't know what I'm doing, so I can definitely fool them now. Taking my furs, I sneaked out through a back door and walking like a tomcat. I made it to the timber. So walking like a tomcat just means walking really fast. I climbed a small dogwood tree and looked back. They were still there and didn't seem to know what I'd done. So he climbed the tree just to see if his dogs were still where he left them, and they were still there. So he's like, yes, they didn't notice I left. Feeling just about as smart as Sherlock Holmes, I headed for the store. I was walking along singing my lungs out when they came tearing out of the underbrush, wiggling and twisting and tickled to death to be with me. At first I was mad, but one look at dancing little Ann and all was forgiven. I sat down on my bundle of fur and laughed till I hurt all over. I could scold them a little, but I could no more have whipped one of them than I could have kissed a girl. After all, a boy just doesn't whip his dogs. So Billy said he thought he had outsmarted them. He saw them there. They seemed like they didn't realize. Then all of a sudden he just saw them come in and start getting so excited, following Billy, and he was just like, oh my gosh, and he was mad at first, but then he's like, oh, whatever, they're so happy to be with me, they're so, I just forgive them. Grandpa always counted my furs carefully and marked something down on a piece of paper. I'd never seen him do this with other hunters, and it got the best out of my curiosity. One day, while he was writing, I asked him, why do you do that, Grandpa? He looked at me over his glasses and said kind of sharp, never mind, I have my reasons. So Grandpa would always count his furs carefully and mark something down on a piece of paper. So Grandpa was probably counting how many furs he was doing, how many furs he was selling. I wonder if that's what Grandpa was marking down, because he was counting the furs and then he would mark something down. So I'm thinking he's counting them. And he's like, okay, he brought 5 today, he brought 10 the other day. And maybe keeping track of them. So he said he'd never seen him do this with any other hunters. It was literally only with Billy that he would do this. So it piqued Billy's curiosity. He was like, I wonder why he's doing that with my furs, but not with everybody else's. When Grandpa talked to me like that, I didn't push things any farther. Besides, it didn't make any difference to me if he marked on every piece of paper in the store. Okay, so when Grandpa would get strict with him and say, never mind, I have my reasons, and get kind of strict, Billy just let it go because he didn't really actually care why he was marking, but he just got a little curious. I always managed to make my trips on Saturdays, as that was Coon Hunters Day. I didn't have to stand around on the outside of the circle anymore and listen to the coon hunters. I'd get right up to the middle and say my piece with the rest of them. Oh, that's cool. So he always tried to come on Saturdays because that's when all the coon hunters would bring their furs. And before, he would stand outside of the circle before he had his dogs, remember? And he would just listen to their stories. Remember, he said he always believed them, no matter how tall of a tales, how exaggerated they were. He would believe every single story because he was just so excited. So now he said he didn't have to stand around on the outside of the circle to listen to them. He could get right in the middle of all of them and also say his stories with his own coon hunting. So that's pretty cool for him. Okay. I didn't have to tell any whoppers, for some of the things my dogs did were almost unbelievable anyhow. Oh, I guess I did make things a little bigger than they actually were, but I never did figure a coon hunter told honest to goodness lies. He just kind of stretched things a little. So Billy said I didn't have to really make anything that exaggerated because the things his dog did, the things that his dogs did were unbelievable. So they were doing crazy things already anyway. So the things he said were already hard to believe. But he said he did stretch the truth a little. But he said that doesn't mean coon hunters are liars. They just stretch the truth. It's just stretch things a little bit more than they should, than actually happened. I could hold those coon hunters spellbound with some of my hunting tales. Grandpa would never say anything while I was telling my stories. So when he says he could hold those coon hunters spellbound, it's almost like they would be staring at him and listening so intensely, almost like they were under a spell. They wouldn't, they would just stare. So that's what that means, spellbound. And Grandpa would never interrupt when he was telling his stories. He just puttered around the store with a silly little grin on his face. Once in a while, when I got too far off the beaten path, he would come around and cram a bar of soap in my pocket. My face would get all red. I cut my story short, fly out the door and head home. Once in a while, when I got too far off the beaten path, I think that what what that means is that he was stretching the truth a little too much. Then that's when Grandpa would do that. He would cram a bar of soap in his pocket, and then Billy would get embarrassed because he got caught stretching the truth a little too much. So then he would fly out of the door and head for home. The coon hunters were always kidding me about my dogs. Some of the remarks I heard made me fighting mad. Oh, I never saw hounds so small, but I guess they are hounds. At least they look like it. That's mean. So they were making comments about how small his dogs were, and they're like, I guess they're hounds, but they're so small. I've never seen them that small before. I don't believe little Ann is half as smart as he says she is. She's so little. Those old coons think she's a rabbit. Oh, that's mean. Why would he? Little Ann is smart, and she's not a rabbit. I bet she sneaks right up on them before they realize she's a dog. So they're saying it's not that little Ann is smart. It's that she's as tiny as a rabbit, so the coons don't even realize she's a dog. So that's how she gets them. It's not because she's smart. It's because she's tiny. And they don't even know she's a dog, because dogs are not that small. Some of these nights, a big old coon is going to carry her off to his den and raise some little coon puppies. Oh no! So they're saying one of these nights a big coon is going to take off little Ann, and I'm thinking feed her to the puppies so that the coon puppies can eat her up. I always took their kidding with a smile on my face, but it made my blood boil like the water in Mama's tea kettle. So they were messing around with him saying these things, and he would pretend like it didn't bother him, but he said his blood would boil like a tea kettle. Oh my goodness. I had one way of shutting them up. Let's all go in the store, I'd say, and see who has the most hides in there. Okay, so he knew how to make them be quiet and stop teasing him about his little dogs, because he would have more hides than most of them, or probably than all of them, who knows. It was true that my dogs were small, especially little Ann. She could walk under an ordinary hound. In fact, she was a regular midget. If it had not been for her long ears, no one could have told that she was a hound. Her actions weren't those of a hunting hound. She was constantly playing. She would play with our chickens and young calves with a piece of paper or a corn cob. When my little girl lacked in size, she made up in sweetness. She could make friends with a tomcat. Okay, so he's saying, yeah, she was little, and if she didn't have the long ears, you wouldn't even know she was a hound. And the way she acted, she was just always playing. So, she didn't seem like a hunting hound because they were probably more serious, and she was way more playful. But she was very sweet, and she could make friends with even a tomcat. Old Dan was just the opposite. He strutted around with a belligerent and tough attitude. Although he wasn't a tall dog, he was heavy. His body was long and his chest was broad and thick. His legs were short, big, and solid. The muscles in his body were hard and knotty. When he walked, they would twist and jerk under the skin. Okay, so Old Dan he had a tough attitude. He was not playful. He was very, very serious. He was really heavy, even though he wasn't really tall, but he was still heavy. So he didn't seem like a little dog, like little Ann at least. And then the muscles in his body were hard and knotty. And that doesn't mean naughty like his muscles are misbehaving and being mischievous. What that means, naughty, is that they were just very stiff. He was a friendly dog. There were no strangers to him. He loved everyone, yet he was a strange dog. He would not hunt with another hound other than little Ann or another hunter, not even my father. The strangest thing about Old Dan was that he would not hunt even with me unless little Ann was with him. I found this out the first night I tried it. So he was friendly, and he was friendly with everybody, but he would only hunt if little Ann was there. And he would not hunt with any other hunter except Billy. So he wanted them to be there. He wanted their little group to be there, not somebody else. Little Ann cut the pad of her right foot on a sharp, jagged flint rock. It was a nasty cut. I made a little boot of leather and put it on her wounded foot to keep her from following me. I locked her in the corn crib. So little Ann cut herself really bad one time. That night that he tried to go with only Old Dan, Billy tried to go hunting with only Old Dan because little Ann cut her foot, so she was hurt. And he wanted her to recover, so he locked her in so she wouldn't follow. 2 nights later, I decided to take Old Dan hunting for a while. He followed me down to the river bottoms and disappeared in the thick timber. I waited and waited for him to strike a trail. Nothing happened. After about 2 hours, I called to him. He didn't come. I called and called. Disgusted, I gave up and went home. So he wanted to go hunting, and he was trying to call Old Dan. Come on, Old Dan, come on, let's go, we're gonna go. And Old Dan just ignored him. He's like, nope, little Ann's not coming, I'm not coming. Coming up through the barn lot, I saw him rolled up in a ball on the ground in front of the corn crib. I immediately understood. I walked over and opened the door. He jumped up in the crib, smelled little Ann's foot, twisted around in the shucks, and lay down by her side. As he looked at me, I read this message in his friendly gray eyes. You could have done this a long time ago. So he wanted to just lay down with little Ann as she got better. He didn't want to go hunting without her. I never did know if little Ann would hunt by herself or not. I'm sure she would have, for she was a smart and understanding dog, but I never tried to find out. So he thought little Ann was smart and she would understand if Old Dan couldn't go. She would still go with Billy, but he never tried to just go with little Ann, so he didn't really know. Little Ann was my sister's pet. They rubbed and scratched and petted her. They would take her down to the creek and give her baths. She loved it all. So his little sisters absolutely loved little Ann and took really good care of her. If Mama wanted a chicken caught, she would call little Ann. She would run the chicken down. And hold it in her paws until Mama came. Not one feather would be harmed. Mama tried Old Dan once. Before she got the chicken, there wasn't much left but the feathers. Oh no. So if Mama wanted to catch a chicken, she would call little Ann, and little Ann would catch the chicken really gently. And then when Old Dan would do it, it would be a mess. could probably hurt the chicken. By some strange twist of nature, little Anne was destined to go through life without being a mother. Perhaps it was because she was stunted in growth, or maybe because she was the runt in a large litter. That may have had something to do with it. So little Anne could never have babies, little puppies of her own. During the first season, November through February, I was given complete freedom from work. Many times when I came home, the sun was was high in the sky. I twisted the words around. After each hunt, I always took care of my dogs. The flint rocks and sawbriars were hard on their feet. With a bottle of peroxide and a can of salve, I would doctor their wounds. Okay, so he's saying that he was giving freedom from work. So that's work around the house, work around the farm. So he would just hunt with the dogs. And then after he came home, their little paws would be so messed up, the little pads on their paws, so he would make sure he took care of them. I never knew what to expect from old Dan. I never saw a coonhound so determined, or one that could get into so many predicaments. More than one time, it would have been the death of him if it hadn't been for smart little Anne. So he said old Dan was just a big mess, and he would always get into so many bad situations, and where he could have died, but little Anne would always save him from it. Maybe that's why, maybe it was smart that he didn't want to go without little Anne, if she's always saving him. One night, not long after I entered the bottoms, my dogs struck the trail of an old boar coon. He was a small old fellow and had a sack full of tricks. He crossed the river time after time. Finally, swimming in the middle and staying in the swift current, he swam downstream. Okay, so they found an old boar coon. I don't even know what that is. I'll have to look that up to see what they look like. Let me put it on pause real quick so that I can check it out. Okay, so the boar raccoon is just a male raccoon. It's just a name for the male one. And they're bigger than the female ones. So the boar raccoon means a boy, big raccoon. Knowing he would have to come out somewhere, my dogs split up. Old Dan took the right side, little Anne worked the other side. I came out of the bottoms into a gravel bar and stood and watched them into the moonlight. Okay, so they split up. One went to the left, one went to the right. And they're just waiting on him to get out of the water because he's going to have to get out one day. Little Anne worked downriver and then she came up. I saw her when she passed me going up the bank, sniffing and searching for the trail. She came back to me. I patted her head, scratched her ears, and talked to her. She kept staring across the river to where old Dan was searching for the trail. Okay. She waded in and swam across to help him. I knew that the coon had not come out of the river on her side. If he had, she would have found the trail. I walked up to the riffle, pulled off my shoes, and waded across. My dogs worked the riverbank up and down. They circled far out into the bottoms. I could hear the loud snuffing of old Dan. He was bewildered and mad. I was getting a thrill from it all, as I had never seen them fooled like this. Okay, so this coon is really smart. So they just can't find him. Little Anne checked all over her side. She has no trail. Old Dan is just sniffing along. He can't find him either. So they hadn't been fooled like this in a really long time. So this is a really smart coon. Old Dan gave up on his side, piled into the river, and swam across to the side little Anne had worked. I knew that it was useless for him to do that. Yeah, because little Anne, if she checks her side and she decides there's no scent, then there is no scent because she's very smart. So old Dan checking her side just to make sure. Billy said that was a waste of time. I was on the point of giving up, calling them to me, and going elsewhere to hunt when I heard the bawl of little Anne. I couldn't believe what I heard. She wasn't bawling on a trail. She was sounding the tree bark. I hurried down the bank, sounding the tree bark. There was a loud splash. I saw old Dan swimming back. By this time, little Anne was really singing a song. In the bright moonlight, I could see old Dan clearly. His powerful front legs were churning the water. Okay. I don't know what it means to sound the tree bark, so let's look that up. 1 second. Oh, that's just the bark that they do when the coon goes into the tree. So that's what that is. Okay, so then I saw a sight that makes a hunter's heart swell with pride. Still swimming, old Dan raised his head high out of the water and bawled. He couldn't wait until he reached the bank to tell little Ann he was coming. From far out in the river, he told her. So, old Dan was so excited that even when he was swimming in the water, he already started bawling so that little Ann could know, I'm coming, little Ann. Reaching the shallows, he plowed out of the river into a sandbar, not even taking time to shake the water from his body. Again, he raised his head and bawled and tore out down the bank. So he's just so excited. He just keeps bawling. He didn't even shake the water off. You know, when dogs get in, they go into the river or into the lake, they get water on them. They always want to shake off the water before they go. He didn't. He just kept going. In a trot, I followed, whooping to let them know I was coming. Before I reached the tree, old Dan's deep voice was making the timber shake. The tree was a large birch, standing right on the bank of the river. The swift current had eaten away at the footing, causing it to lean. The lower branches of the tree dangled in the water. I saw how the smart old coon had pulled his trick. Coming in toward the bank from midstream, he had caught the dangling limbs and climbed up. Exhausted from the long swim, he stayed there in the birch, thinking he had outsmarted my dogs. I couldn't understand how little Ann had found him. So this tree was, it seemed like the bottom of the tree was kind of, some animal had, oh no, the swift current had eaten away. So it kind of gotten damaged at the bottom of the tree at the footing with the current, and it caused the tree to kind of lean over. So it wasn't straight up, it was leaning sideways. And because of that, all of the branches were just kind of like falling, touching inside of the water of the river. So when the coon was swimming, it climbed onto those branches and got in the tree. So then they lost the scent. And the coon was very tired from swimming, so it just stayed there. But Billy still couldn't understand how little Ann found him there if there was no trail. It was impossible to fall the tree toward the bottoms. It was too much off balance. I did the next best thing. I cut a long elder switch. Unbuckling one of my suspenders, I tied it to the end and climbed the tree. Okay, so he climbed the tree with a switch and his suspenders. The coon was sitting in a fork of the limb. Taking my switch, I whipped him a good one, and out he came. He sailed out over the river. With a loud splash, he hit the water and swam for the other side. My dogs jumped off the bank after him. They were no match against his expert swimming. On reaching the other bank, he ran downriver. Okay, so Billy took that switch, and the switch is just kind of a branch with no leaves on it. So, and he hit the coon with that switch, and after he did that, then he jumped off of the tree and started swimming again, and then and just went downriver. Well, he swam, and then he got to the other side of the river, and then he just started running down. Climbing down out of the tree, I picked up my axe and lantern and trotted down to another riffle and waded across. I could tell by the bawling of my dogs they were close to the coon. He would have to climb a tree or be caught on the ground. All at once their voices stopped. I stood still and waited for them to bawl. Treed. Nothing happened. Thinking the coon had taken to the river again, I waited to give them time to reach the opposite bank. I waited and waited. I could hear nothing. By then I knew he had not crossed over. I thought perhaps they had caught him on the ground. I hurried on. Okay, so he's waiting to hear his dogs bawling so he can keep following their balls, but they're not making any noise, so he doesn't know what's happening. Maybe they caught him on the ground, and so they're too busy, holding on to him to be able to bawl with their mouths. I came to a point where a slough of crystal clear water ran into the river. On the other side was a bluff. I could hear one of my dogs over there. As I watched and waited, I heard a dog jump in the water. It was little Ann. She swam across and came to me, staying with me for just a second. She jumped in the slough and swam back to the other side. What's happening? Okay, he got over there. He saw little Ann. She's swimming back and forth. I could hear her sniffing and whining. I couldn't figure out where old Dan was. By squatting down and holding the lantern high over my head, I could see dimly the opposite bank. Little Ann was running up and down. I noticed she always stayed in one place of about 25 yards, never leaving that small area. Where is old Dan? Did he fall somewhere? What happened? She ran down to the water's edge and stared out into the slough. The horrible thought came that old Dan had drowned. Oh no. I knew a big coon was capable of drowning a dog in water by climbing on his head and forcing him under. Ooh, I can't believe coons can do that. I didn't know that. So coons can drown a dog if they get on top of his head and push his head down. As fast as I could run, I circled the slough, climbed up over the bluff, and came down to where little Ann was. She was hysterical, running up and down the bank and whining. Oh my gosh, she is really just upset. So there's something going on with old Dan. I tied my lantern on a long pole, held it out over the water, and looked for old Dan's body. I could see clearly in the clear spring waters, but I couldn't see my dog anywhere. I sat down on the bank, buried my face in my hands, and cried. I was sure he was gone. So he really thought that old Dan drowned. He just couldn't find him anywhere. Several minutes passed, and all that time little Ann had never stopped, running here and there along the bank. She kept sniffing and whining. I heard when she started digging. I looked around. She was 10 feet from the water's edge. I got up and went over to her. She was digging a small hole about the size of a big apple. It was the air hole for a muskrat den. Okay, there was a little hole, and he said that's for a muskrat den, and she was digging. I pulled little Ann away from the hole, knelt down, and put my ear to it. I could hear something and feel a vibration in the ground. It was an eerie sound and seemed to be coming from far away. I listened. Finally, I understood what the noise was. So he went to the ground where little Ann was digging, and he heard something in that hole. It was the voice of old Dan. Little Ann had opened up the hole enough with her digging so his voice could be heard faintly. In some way, he had gotten into that old muskrat den. I knew that down under the bank in the water, the entrance to the den could be found. Rolling up my sleeve, I tried to find it with my hand. I had no luck. It was too far down. So old Dan fell into an old muskrat den, and now Billy has to try and get him out. So he tried to do it with his just with his hand, but he wasn't able to. It was too far down. There was only one thing to do. Leaving my axe and lantern, I ran for home. Picking up a long-handled shovel, I hurried back. The sun was high in the sky before I dug old Dan out. He was a sight to see, nothing but mud from the tip of his nose to the end of his tail. I held onto his collar and led him down to the river to wash off. The water there was much warmer than the cold spring water of the slough. Okay, so he got him out, and it was already daytime when he finally was able to dig old Dan out. That's how deep he had fallen in, and then he just led him down to the river to wash off, and there was warmer water there, so he wouldn't be cold. After washing him, I turned him loose. Right back to the hole he ran. Little Ann was already digging. I knew the coon was still there. Working together, we dug him out. Oh, so they got the coon. After the coon was killed, I saw what had made him so smart. His right front foot was twisted and shriveled. At one time, he must have been caught in a trap and had pulled himself free. He was an old coon. His face was almost white. He was big and heavy and had beautiful fur. Okay, so this was an old coon who had gotten trapped before, and since they're smart, if they get trapped once, then they start to become really just more clever and start to learn not to get trapped. Tired, muddy, wet, and hungry, I started for home. I often wondered how old Dan got into that old muskrat den. Perhaps there was another entrance I had overlooked. I'll never know. One night, far back in the mountains, in a place called the Cyclone Timber, old Dan really pulled a good one. Many years before my time, a terrible cyclone had ripped its way through the mountains, leaving its scar in the form of fallen timber, twisted and snarled. The path of the cyclone was several miles wide and several miles long. It was wonderful place to hunt, as it abounded with game. Okay, so Billy never found out how old Dan got into the muskrat den. But he said there was something else that he said Dan pulled a good one in a place called the Cyclone Timber. Okay, and Grandpa's talking. Not Grandpa. This is Billy talking as a older man, and he's just saying many years before he was even born, there was a terrible cyclone that ripped through the mountains, and a lot of trees fell down, and they were all twisted and snarled. In the path of the cyclone that the cyclone ripped through and destroyed all of these trees was several miles wide and several miles long. So then people would go over there to hunt because there were so many animals to hunt through that path. My dogs had struck the trail of a coon about an hour before. They had really been warming him up. I knew it was about time for him to take up a tree, and sure enough, I heard the deep voice of old Dan telling the world he had a coon up a tree. Okay. I was trotting along, going to them, when his voice stopped. I could hear little Ann, but not old Dan. I wondered why and was a little scared, for I just knew something had happened. Then I heard his voice. It seemed louder than it had been before. I felt much better. Okay, so he was going to the dogs, and then he heard little Ann, but he couldn't hear old Dan, and he got scared, probably because last time he fell into the muskrat den. So he just, and as Billy said, a lot of times old Dan almost died, but little Ann saved him. Just so when he heard his voice really loud, then he felt better about it. When I came up to the tree, I thought little Ann had tread old Dan. She was sitting on her haunches, staring up and bawling the bark tree. There, a good 15 feet from the ground, with his hind legs planted firmly firmly planted. Anyway, there, a good 15 feet from the ground, with his hind legs planted firmly in the center of a big limb, and his front feet against the trunk of the tree, stood old Dan, bawling for all he was worth. Okay, so he was there. His hind legs were on the center limb and his front feet against the trunk. Oh, he was just, because there was a coon there. Above him, some 8 or 9 feet, was a baby coon. I was glad it was a young one, for if it had been an old one, he would have jumped out. Old Dan would have followed, and he surely would have broken all of his legs. From where I was standing, I could see it was impossible for old Dan to have climbed the tree. It was dead and more of an old snag than a tree, with limbs that were crooked and twisted. The bark had rotted away and fallen off, leaving the trunk bare and slick as glass. It was a good 10 feet up to the first limb. I couldn't figure out how old Dan had climbed that tree. There had to be a solution somewhere. So old Dan climbed the tree somehow, but it was an old tree that had that was already dead, and so when it's dead, then the bark isn't really, there's not a lot of kind of grippy, thick, pokey bark to kind of put your feet on and give you some good a good grip to climb it. When it's old, it just starts to get really slippery, and there's not anywhere to grip to climb up. So Billy was trying to figure out how Dan even got up there. Walking around to the other side, I saw how he had accomplished his feat. There in the bottom was a large hole. The old tree was hollow. Stepping back, I looked up and could see another hole, which had been hidden from me because of old Dan's body. Okay, so there was a hole all the way, a large hole all the way at the bottom, and then if you looked up, there was another one at the top, so he probably climbed from inside. He had simply crawled into the hole at the bottom, climbed up the hollow of the tree, and worked his way out on the limb. In some way, he had turned around and reared up, placing his front feet inside against the trunk. So it's kind of like he had turned and just started climbing up with his back on one side of the tree, and kind of like if the tree is like this, then he has his feet this way, and then he's climbing up like that, and his back is on that side. Okay. There he was. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't cut the tree down, and I was afraid to climb it for fear I would scare the coon into jumping out. If he did, old Dan would jump too and break his legs. Okay, so Billy didn't know what to do because the coon was all the way up there. It was a baby coon, and he thought if he tries to cut the tree, he's going to fall. The baby coon's going to jump out, and since old Dan is all the way up there too, he's going to jump after him. Usually the trees are, last time when they put a coon in a tree, then the tree was not hollow, so old Dan couldn't even go up there. So there was no fear of him jumping after the coon and being all the way over there up the tree. I ran plan after plan around in my mind. None would work. I finally came to the conclusion that I had to climb the tree and get a hold of that crazy dog. I blew out my lantern, pulled off my shoes and socks, and started shimmying up the tree. I prayed that the coon wouldn't jump out. Okay, so Billy was trying to think of what should I do to get old Dan out of there, and he just thought, I just have to climb the tree myself and go get him. Inching along, being as quiet as I could, I made it up to old Dan and grabbed his collar. I sat down on the limb and held him tight. He would bawl now and then and all but burst my eardrums. I couldn't drop him to the ground, and I couldn't climb down with him. I couldn't sit there on that limb and hold him all night. I would be no better off when daylight came. Oh man, so he can't climb down with old Dan. But he also couldn't drop him to the ground because it was way too high. So he had no idea what he was going to do with him. Glancing at the hole by my side gave me the solution to my problem. I thought if he came out of this hole, he can go back in it. That was the way I got my dog down from the tree. This had its problems too. In the first place, old Dan didn't want to be put in the hole head first. By scolding, pushing, shoving, and squeezing, I finally got him started on his way. So he was trying to push his head in first, and old Dan didn't want to, so he had to push and shove and squeeze, and finally he started going down the tree again. Like a fool, I sat there on the limb waiting to see him come out of the bottom, and come out he did, turning around, bawling as he did. Right back in the hole he went. So Billy just sat there waiting for him to come out from the bottom, and then he did, but then he went right back into the hole. There was nothing I could do but sit and wait. I understood why his voice had stopped for a while. He just took time out to climb a tree. Putting my ear to the hole, I could hear him coming. Grunting and clawing up he came. I helped him out of the hole, turned him around, and crammed him back in. That time I wasn't too gentle with my work. I was tired of sitting on the limb, and my bare feet were getting cold. So the first time he was a little more gentle, pushing him through the hole so he could go down from the tree. But this time he was already his feet were cold, he was tired, and he's just like, get in there, and kind of squeezed old Dan a little bit more roughly. I started down the same time he did. He beat me down. Looking over my shoulder, I saw him turn around and head back for the hole. I wasn't far from the ground, so I let it go. The flint rocks didn't feel too good on my feet when I landed. I jumped to the hole just in time to see the tip end of his long tail disappearing. I grabbed it, holding on with one hand. I worked my legs down with my other and pulled him out. I stopped his tree climbing by cramming rocks and chunks into the hole. Okay, so Billy had to go right after him once he went into the hole, and then he had to go running and grab him, and he got him just in time before he was going to go into the hole, and he grabbed his tail and pulled him out. And then he just covered the hole with cramming rocks and all kinds of stuff in the hole so that old Dan couldn't get in anymore. How the coon stayed in the tree, I'll never know, but stay he did. With a well-aimed rock, I scared him out. Old Dan satisfied his lust to kill. So Billy threw a rock at the coon, and the coon got scared and got off of the tree, and old Dan was able to get him. I started for home. I had all the hunting I wanted for that night. Okay, that's the end of chapter 10.